Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining our webinar, Diabetes, Clearing Up Carb Confusion. I'm Brittany Reynolds, a registered dietitian and Wegmans nutritionist, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Please note that the information that will be provided during the webinar today is for educational purposes only. It's not intended as a substitute or replacement for medical advice, medical nutrition therapy, or individualized nutrition counseling. Now, I'll be rejoining you at the end to moderate our Q&A, but I am now pleased to introduce your presenter, registered dietitian and fellow Wegmans nutritionist, Kirby Branciforte. Take it away, Kirby.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I am really hoping that when you leave here today, you'll have a better understanding of some terminology around carbohydrates, that you'll feel empowered to make decisions that pertain to your own diabetes journey, and you'll have some tools in your toolbox to get started. We do actually have folks with all types of diabetes joining us today. I know you were asked that question when you registered. So we have people with prediabetes, with type 1, with LADA or type 1.5 and type 2. And also some people wrote in, they don't have diabetes, they just want to learn more. So welcome to everyone. I will try my best to mention how some of these concepts pertain to specific types of diabetes, but if you do have a question and you want to throw that in the details there, please feel more than welcome to do so. So we have a lot of ground to cover. We are going to start with some carbohydrate basics. So we find that individuals with prediabetes and diabetes often have fear around carbohydrates because they are broken down into glucose, and that is the thing that will have the most direct and immediate impact on your blood sugar. And it's actually not uncommon for us to have people ask them if they should avoid carbs altogether. However, carbs are an incredibly important macronutrient that our bodies rely on for everyday functioning. They are the preferred source of fuel for our brains. That glucose goes and fuels our brains, our thinking, our executive functions. And that glucose is the main source of energy that we use for movement and physical activity. And it also helps to grow and preserve muscle. In fact, if you don't have enough carbohydrate on board to supply the glucose your body needs, your body might actually break down muscle and lean body tissue and take the amino acids it gets from that and convert those into glucose. It wants that glucose so badly. So carbs are needed for all of these things. They are found in almost everything we eat, to be honest. So fruits, vegetables, beans and legumes, dairy, like your milk and yogurt, nuts, seeds, and grains. So almost all foods have them, except for meat, seafood, and fats like your oils, butter, cheese, and things like that. So carbs are not bad. These foods are not bad. When we're thinking about managing blood sugar, we're really more thinking about quality, timing, portion sizes, and we'll get into that later. But it's really important to know that individuals with all types of diabetes and without diabetes should still consume their carbohydrate foods so they can continue to think, to move, and to grow. Let's start here with a distinction between carbs and sugar. So this is a place where we hear a lot of people get tripped up. So first, let's take a look at the label and kind of explain what total carbohydrate is. You see that it is in that bold black print. That is made up of all of the information that you see under it indented. So carbs on the label are going to include dietary fiber, total sugars, that includes naturally occurring and added, starch, which you'll sometimes see listed as other carbohydrates on the label, and sugar alcohols. And now we often have people ask us, like, can we have lower sugar items to help support diabetes? But what we actually want to know is that the impact on blood sugar is actually coming from that total number you see there, total carbs, not just that total sugar. So this one right here, this is the number that you want to look at when you're considering your carbohydrate intake for diabetes management. Now, while we're here, let's just take a quick look at the label to talk about how you can calculate the carbs, because we did get asked a lot, how do I find out how many carbs are in my food? So the very first thing, your very first stop, anytime you're trying to read a label, is going to be right here up at the top. You have to check that serving size because everything listed on the label is based on that serving size. So if you were to have 2 slices of whatever this mystery food is, then you would double everything on the label, including your carbohydrates. So 2 slices would be 42 grams of carbs. Now that 48 grams that you see listed after the slice is actually how much a slice should weigh approximately if you were to actually place the slice on a kitchen scale. So that information could be really important for folks or of interest to folks who are trying to get very precise with their carbohydrate counting, because it's a little bit more accurate than the measurement of a slice. So that might include people who are using insulin or on pump therapy, or if you're really looking to fine tune your diabetes management, your blood sugar management, that might be of interest to you. But most folks can kind of start with the household measure that you see there. Now, sticking with this idea of sugar, let's take a look at some of the claims you might encounter about sugar. So here are some common things that we see: reduced sugar, sugar-free, and no added sugars. You see listed here their actual FDA regulated definition of what those mean. So reduced sugar has to have 25% less than the regular version. Sugar-free has to have less than 0.5 grams. No added sugars has to have less than 0.5 grams. So that's what those mean from a definition standpoint. What they don't mean is no carbs. So a lot of folks will think that this will mean that there are no carbs in the food, and that is just not the case. So here's a great example: a bread that has a sugar-free claim right on the label. You see that there? Sure enough, you can see total sugars equals 0 grams, but take a peek at the total carbs. There's 9 grams of carbs in a slice. So a product that says sugar-free actually has carbohydrates. If we take this a step further, most people aren't having just one slice of bread. Maybe you have one slice, but a lot of people are going to have 2 slices. And remember, we have to double that. So now we've got 18 grams of carbs in a sugar-free product. So that's certainly going to have an impact on your blood sugar and should be considered in your total carbohydrates for the meal. So those sugar-free, reduced sugar, no added sugar, you might be looking at those for some other reason, but they're not necessarily going to point you to something that is like a diabetes-friendly or no-carb product. And understanding this label reading and how many carbs are in your food is really important for folks with type 2 diabetes or gestational diabetes, where you have a carbohydrate goal. For type 1 or LATA, if you are dosing your insulin on this information. And for prediabetes, if you want to start to understand how many carbohydrates you're eating in a meal or at your snacks, that's really good data for you to have to work with your healthcare team on. So that is where we're looking at our total carbohydrates and the difference between carbs and sugar and what those things can mean. I'm going to guess that between when I started and right now, a bunch of you are out there wondering about, well, what about net carbs? You said it's total carbohydrates that has an impact on blood sugar, but I thought we were supposed to talk about net carbs. So let's dig into that. So net carbs is an equation that is essentially total carbohydrates with the fiber and the sugar alcohol subtracted out. Sometimes that's meant to, it's actually not a regulated definition. So some people might actually calculate it differently. They might only take out the fiber and not the sugar alcohol. So it's important to know that when you see net carbs on a package, people might be calculating it in a different way than one person to the next. So important to note that. The idea here and the reason that people are interested in net carbs is the premise is that fiber and sugar alcohols don't raise your blood sugar. Now, while it is true that most fibers do not get digested, they slow digestion, they actually promote a really slow gradual rise in your blood sugar, the fact is some are partially digested. Some parts of sugar alcohols are partially digested, and these pieces can impact your blood sugar. So it's not really accurate to say that we can remove those and understand what the blood sugar impact will be. And we also know that this approach of just looking at total carbohydrates when we're thinking about blood sugar management is a best practice. It captures generally what the information that folks need to know for their counting their carbohydrates. So it is not necessarily a recommended practice. Well, it's not a recommended practice by the American Diabetes Association for those reasons. However, some providers will use it in their guidance. So that's maybe a conversation that you might have with your doc to say, you know, how is this kind of being folded into my care? And some people might actually find some use in it. And I will say that this is the rare case of somebody with a very high fiber diet, because honestly, most of us are not getting a very high fiber diet. Most of us aren't even eating half of the amount of fiber that's recommended. But for individuals who have high fiber meals with regularity or have a high fiber diet, they might find that reducing their total carb count by the amount of fiber that they're having could be useful. But even in that situation, they're not necessarily using this equation. They're going to tailor their approach to their individual blood sugar response to certain foods. Similarly, with type 1, you might notice that you're going to use a little less or a little bit more insulin depending on what you eat. But again, not necessarily using this equation and not using the net carbs that somebody might put on a package where you're not even sure how they calculated it. So what it boils down to is that the practice that is recommended is really monitoring your own blood sugar response to certain foods, particularly if it's low fiber or high fiber, and seeing what's going on with your own individual situation. Now, if you have prediabetes and you're wondering, should I look at net carbs? You would hope that a net carb claim is going to lead you to products that would have a lower blood glucose impact, but because of what we discussed, that's really not the case. And we'll talk about a strategy that might work a little bit better in a bit. So now let's move on to glycemic index and load. These are concepts that are kind of attempt to quantify the impact on blood sugar from specific foods. So we'll define them and then we'll talk about how you might consider them. So glycemic index is on a scale from 1 to 100, and it illustrates or tries to define how quickly blood sugar may rise after a 50-gram carb portion of an individual food. So the theory here is that if you have a low glycemic index, that should lead to a more stable blood sugar, because pure sugar has a glycemic index of 100, and we see a very quick blood sugar spike there. However, this isn't super useful because we're talking about a 50-gram carb portion of food. And if you think back to our bread example that had 9 grams of carbs in it, that would mean it would take 5.5 slices of that bread to equal what the scale is kind of based on. So that's why we have a second measure called glycemic load. And this is described as being either low, moderate, or high. And this helps to illustrate how quickly and how much your blood sugar may rise after a typical portion of an individual food. Now, to illustrate the difference between these two, let's take a look at a donut and watermelon. Both of these foods actually have a high glycemic index, and I think that's actually identical, a glycemic index. However, when you look at the load, so the typical portion of the food you would eat, the donut has a moderate glycemic load, while the watermelon has a low glycemic load. So if you were choosing it just based on the index, that's really not giving you the full picture. And honestly, there is some limitations with these, because while this might sound like it's going to lead you to foods that will have a lower glycemic impact, these terms do not consider what happens when you combine these foods with other foods. So we rarely eat foods in total isolation, right? We're putting them together in snacks and we're putting them together in meals. And when you start adding in other foods, the glycemic load and overall glycemic impact changes, because when you add things like fiber, protein, and fat, those things can help to slow digestion and actually promote a more gradual and lower rise in blood sugar. And the opposite is true too. So this really doesn't give you the full impact of what happens when you actually eat a full meal. They also don't really take into account your individual physiology and your own body. We all have different genetics. We all have varying degrees of insulin resistance and sensitivity and just different overall health. So these numbers really aren't actually going to tell you what might happen with that food in your body. And they also, at the end of the day, aren't telling you how healthful a food might be. So low glycemic load doesn't mean healthy. High glycemic load doesn't mean unhealthy. And one of my favorite examples of this is carrots. For the longest time, and we still do on occasion, hear folks say, well, I can't have carrots because they're high glycemic. And somewhere along the line, folks learn that. And truly, it's actually boiled carrots that have a high glycemic index. But when you look at the load, it's very low. And then again, it does not take into account what happens when you have them as part of a meal. So people might be avoiding foods because they're being described in this kind of limited framework. These concepts could potentially be helpful for folks. So I don't want to say they're never helpful. Providers might still use them, but they're kind of specific situations. So if you are consistently having a meal with regularity and keep seeing a blood sugar spike after that specific meal, and you are not sure what food might be the kind of like carbohydrate culprit, you could use these references to try to figure out like which food is doing that, maybe reducing the portion on that food. So in that specific situation, it could be helpful. And in type 1 diabetes, these are kind of beneficial to know about in general because the effect of protein and fat in this population is actually a little bit different. So it doesn't necessarily totally prevent blood sugar spikes, but it might delay it when you add protein and fat in there. So you might use these to know if you're having higher glycemic load foods to help with insulin dose and timing. But again, these are really specific situations. And generally speaking, these concepts are kind of distracting us from looking at the overall glycemic impact of actual meals in your body. So there's pieces missing from this puzzle if you hyper-focus on this. So what do you want to focus on instead? Instead, we want to think about how we're building meals to support a stable blood sugar after your meal. What you see here is called the diabetes plate, and we get this from the American Diabetes Association. It's a visual way to build your meals. There's no calculations. We're not consulting charts. And it shows us kind of the ratio and combination of foods that are going to promote good blood sugar management. So we see here is a half a plate of non-starchy veggies, and then a quarter plate of grains or starchy veggies, and a quarter plate of your protein foods. You can add fruit, milk, and yogurt on the side. Those are kind of going to depend on your individual needs because they do have carbohydrates. So you kind of work to figure out how those might fit in your picture. But when we look at the plate itself, we see that we can build our plate with a portion of carbohydrates containing foods whose blood sugar impact is going to be somewhat blunted by the other foods there. So we've got protein and we've got a nice half plate of non-starchy veggies. And then if you add a healthy fat, like a drizzle of olive oil, that even slows digestion more. And those combinations of things in relation to each other is actually what promotes that gradual rise and fall of blood sugar. So this is a concept that's great for people with diabetes to get started. It visually shows you how you might want to start maybe shifting portions and combinations of your meals to move towards a pattern that supports blood sugar management. And you might notice that this is showing maybe smaller portions of foods that you normally have and additions of foods that you might not normally have. So this is really a nice representation of the shifts that folks might want to consider that still allows us to enjoy foods like our pasta, rice, and potatoes and things with the grains and the starchy veggies, but in a way that's going to support your blood sugar. Now, when you're selecting the foods that are going to go in here, there are some tips as well. So first, just picking whole and minimally processed versions of these foods is always a good start. So having whole fruits and veggies involved. But when you're looking at like individual products, you're looking at packages and nutrition facts, couple of tips. So first of all, looking for 10% DV or more, so that daily value for fiber. That means it's a good source of fiber. Fiber is only found in plant foods, so you're getting the health benefits of those plant foods. And also, fiber has been shown to support those good gut bacteria, and we're learning that some of those bacteria actually lower blood sugar, which is just like amazing to me. So make friends with fiber and look for that 10% DV. And at the same time, we're going to think about limiting saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. So under 10% is great. Under 5% is even better because that means it's kind of a low source of those foods or of those nutrients. And doing these in combination is going to kind of help you navigate to products that are more nutrient dense. And it's also going to help you make selections that are good for heart health, because we do know that individuals with diabetes are at greater risk for heart disease, and they are, kind of coincide quite a bit, so much so that they're actually kind of call it like cardiometabolic syndrome, I think. So really important to keep an eye on these nutrients so you're taking care of your heart as well. Another thing you might consider doing is some simple swaps with your refined grains. So refined grains tend to have little or no fiber, where their whole grain counterparts tend to have more fiber, and just including more whole grains in general is associated with better blood sugar management, reduced risk for heart disease. So not necessarily saying you have to completely stop eating refined grains and put in whole grain versions, But you could start to think about where you're getting those refined grains and what you might do. So you might switch to a whole grain version. So like a brown rice crackers, whole grain crackers, whole wheat bread, whole grain cereal, looking for a whole grain wellness key on our Wegmans brand products when you're shopping with us. So again, these are options to swap in if you want. But if you're like, you know what, white rice is incredibly important to me in my cultural cuisine, absolutely still room for these things. So other swaps you might think about is like maybe you're swapping elsewhere in your diet, or maybe you're swapping to a smaller portion size. Or when you're having these foods, maybe you're making sure that you know that their impact on your blood sugar can be lessened if you're adding things like those fibrous plant foods and fruits and veggies, and serving them with lean proteins and things like that. So these are just areas where we can kind of fine tune. And all of this is to say that when we build our meals in this way and we focus on the quality of our choices, that's a practical way to manage our blood sugars. And while we do want to keep an eye on our number of total carbohydrates that we're eating, there's not as much calculation involved when you do something like this. And when we get kind of caught in those weeds, it could distract us from what really matters in blood sugar management, which is how we're building our meals and our overall pattern of eating. And this is also, great to keep in mind with the holidays coming up. So lastly, a couple of things to wrap up before we move to questions. I want to show you where you can find our diabetes resources on Wegmans.com. So Wegmans.com, you'll navigate up to the top here at Health and Nutrition. These are our Feel Your Best pages that have lots of great information, but under special diets and eating approaches, that's where you'll find all of our stuff for living with diabetes. Here at the top is a webinar that my colleague Marta did on building meals for type 2. And then again, a section on meal inspiration. It says type 2, but this is really great for everybody, all types of diabetes, and no diabetes as well. Here you see that plate. And then below that, it's going to give you some more examples for which foods fit into each category. So making those quality choices. And then meal inspiration. So actual meals that align with that plate. We even show you how they kind of fit into that visual. So you can get started with practical food solutions that make building these meals for blood sugar management so much easier and actually more exciting and delicious. The last thing I'll say is just a note about how important it is to recognize that this is individualized. The amount of carbs that we need per meal, how much we might need to snack, how much we need at a snack, this is all individualized. Especially for type 2 diabetes. And that is because our blood sugar response is highly, highly variable. The same food can be eaten by two different people, and you will see a vastly different blood sugar response. So it's very variable. It's very important to kind of get to know your own blood sugar response and how that is looking in your picture. And we know that blood sugar is also affected by lots of different factors, like stress, if you're under stress, if you're sick, if you're recovering from an injury, gut health, like I mentioned before. So it's just so important to understand your own carbohydrate picture when you're eating, how much, in what combinations, so you get to know what your carbohydrate story is, so you can kind of share it with your provider and fine tune and find the path forward that's right for you. And with that, I think we've got some time for questions. I will pull my slides down. And hello, Brittany.
Hello, fantastic, Kirby. Such great information. Before we hop into questions, just folks, please note that when you leave this webinar, you will be directed to a survey. And if you're watching this webinar on demand, that link can be found in the description below the video. We do really thank you in advance for taking a few minutes to complete that survey. It's truly valuable feedback for us. But again, fantastic job. And just a few questions. And the first, we had some more nutrient food specific pop up in the Q&A. The first, maybe could you just briefly define or explain what a sugar alcohol is?
Oh, yeah. So it's neither a sugar or an alcohol, oddly enough. It is a carbohydrate. It's found naturally in foods, but it's often added to foods. So you'll see like mannitol, xylitol, those are sugar alcohols. It's just as a molecule, it is a carbohydrate. And it does, like I said, it's kind of only a portion of it is digested, but it adds some calories and, like I said, carbohydrates. So
wonderful. Yeah. And exactly. A lot of times I tell folks if they see that OL on the end when they're looking at food ingredients, that would be considered likely the food or the sugar alcohol ingredient. That's just a good question. Just in the store, looking for 100% whole wheat or whole grain specifically, how can they find that 100% or whole whole wheat, whole grain when doing their shopping?
Oh, absolutely. So in the store specifically, we do have a Wegmans wellness key, that a whole grain wellness key. So that's a little like picture of a piece of grain, and it will tell you how many servings of whole grain are in that product per serving. If it's not a Wegmans brand product, sometimes you can find the Whole Grains Council has a whole grain stamp. Mm-hmm. So those are just nice indicators to know that there's enough whole grain in there that it counts at least towards your whole grain servings. And we do have a way to filter on our website as well our products by our whole grain wellness key. So that's another way to look before you head out to the store.
Great. Yeah. And important, I think, too, some folks, it's whole grain is the
first ingredient.
The broader term, whereas whole wheat would be examples of,
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yes. So lots of different grains can be whole grain. They don't have to be
But
wheat.
I love that, again, we had that question. So I love that folks are thinking how they can, you mentioned carbs are important, and they're already thinking about some of those beneficial carbs. Speaking of carbs, quite a few questions around how many carbs should folks be eating per meal or snack, or then we also had a question even throughout the day. How many carbs should folks be having?
Yes. So again, I mentioned, I'll come back to that idea of individualization. So there is a number of carbs that I think it's like, I want to say 120 grams a day or something, but don't quote me on that, but like that your body needs to function. So that is kind of a separate question from what I think is really what we're getting at is how many to have per meal or snack. The number of carbs you would have per meal, especially when you have type 2 diabetes, that is something you are going to arrive at by working with your healthcare provider, because what they'll do is there'll be some information sharing. We'll take a look at what is happening to your blood sugar after you eat meals, or they'll look at your overall blood sugar picture. And then they have a way to kind of fine tune and find out how many carbs per meal are right for you. If you have type 1 diabetes, you really, you can have as many carbs as you want. You just are dosing your insulin to that. So a little bit different answer for those folks. And I have heard this idea of like with snacks that a starting point is 15 grams of carbs, because that's kind of the threshold where after that you'll start to see a spike in blood sugar that might be tough to come down from, especially if you're wedging that in between meals. But to make sure that no carb is left alone, that's one thing I've heard, is that if you're snacking, to make sure you do have those with something like a protein or a healthy fat like a nut. So hopefully that helps.
No, that's wonderful. And then to piggyback off someone, and I love this question, is there a best time or worst time to eat carbs?
No, I mean, in general, no. But again, this is something where you want to look at what's happening in your own picture. So a lot of people will find that if they have too many carbs at night, they might have a high blood sugar overnight. And so they might make some adjustments just to get that management under control a little bit, especially because nighttime is a good time to kind of let your body settle and kind of get your overall, like your A1C down. So that 3-month measure of blood sugar. And so not in terms of the time of day. We have seen a little bit of rumbling about some research that people have done on when to have your carbs in your meal. So like leaving them to last. There's not enough there to say that everyone should do that. But if you're willing to try that and see what happens with your blood sugar, it's something that wouldn't hurt. But I'm a gal who likes to have all my stuff kind of together. So, it really is is that something that you want to try and could sustain? So.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And then I don't know, maybe in 10 or 15 seconds,
I think we can do another one.
Zoom out a little bit. Can you answer, is there a best diet for diabetes when we think Mediterranean, keto, all those out there? What's the best diet?
Yeah. So I'll start at least by saying that I know a lot of folks are interested in this idea of keto because it's so low in carbohydrate, but a word of caution with that, do this with your provider. And if it's something that as a team, you've decided that it is a good step for your blood sugar management, we need to be looking at those other measures like triglycerides, because that's a high fat diet and that could now put you at higher risk for heart disease. So just so folks know, that is a concern with when you're moving to a keto diet. But in general, I would say that, we always go to our gold standard of like a plant forward diet. And you can find on our website on that Feel Your Best page, if you were to go to our whole body health section, we have our healthy eating guidelines on there. That's basically an outline of all of the foods that we know are good for overall good health. And it is an eating pattern that is supportive of diabetes management. So lots of plants, lean proteins, things like that. So
Absolutely. Well, Kirby, we've reached the end of our time together, but thank you again for the incredible, the valuable information you've shared. And on behalf of our nutrition team, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to our time that we're together next.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.